My mother left me in the middle of nowhere at the age of 9 as a joke. They laughed and bet if I could find my way home. I never went back. 23 years later, they found me. That night I had 79 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers of the Four Seasons Hotel in Atlanta cast a glow over the charity gala. I stood at the podium looking out at a sea of wealthy investors and politicians. My name is Valerie Dubois. I am 32 years old and a partner at one of the most ruthless private equity firms. I built my life from nothing. I specialize in acquiring distressed assets and liquidating failing companies. I am good at what I do because I learned early on that survival requires cold calculation. I was in the middle of my keynote speech about corporate responsibility when the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. The elegant atmosphere shattered instantly. A loud, familiar voice cut through the respectful silence of the room. "Oh my God, look at the runaway trash daughter wearing stolen silk." My blood turned to ice, but my face remained perfectly still. I recognized that voice immediately. It belonged to Yvonne, my biological mother. Walking right beside her was my older sister Rochelle. She was the golden child who never did any wrong. Following closely behind them was Trent. He was the arrogant white husband of Rochelle and the CEO of a struggling commercial real estate startup. Security guards rushed forward to intercept them, but Yvonne was already putting on a theatrical performance for the crowd. She pushed past a waiter, causing a tray of champagne flutes to crash to the marble floor. Everyone in the ballroom turned to stare at the commotion. The elite of Atlanta society watched in stunned silence as this chaotic group marched toward the stage. I did not flinch. I did not step back from the microphone. I simply reached over to the podium, took my glass of champagne, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I waited for her tantrum to pause. Yvonne stopped right at the edge of the stage. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, playing the role of the heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. "You abandoned us," she cried out loudly enough for the microphones to pick it up. "You made this family cry a river of tears for 23 years. Your disappearance gave your poor stepfather a fatal heart attack. You owe this family. You owe us your life." The guests began whispering among themselves. Some looked shocked, while others seemed eager for the drama to unfold. I stood there looking at the woman who had discarded me like garbage on a rainy highway over 2 decades ago. Trent stepped forward, wrapping an arm around Rochelle. He looked up at me with a condescending smirk. "Listen, Valerie," he said, his voice oozing with a fake white savior complex. "We are willing to forgive you for running away and causing all that pain. We just need a small favor in return. I hear you run the loan division at Dubois Capital now. My company is facing a tiny cash flow issue. If you authorize an emergency loan of $5 million for me by tomorrow morning, we can consider your debt to us paid in full. Do this small thing, and we might even let you come to Christmas dinner." Rochelle nodded in agreement. "Do not be selfish, Valerie," she added loudly. "You have millions and our mother is struggling. If you do not help Trent save his company, we will go to the press. We will tell everyone how you turned your back on your black family the second you got money. We will expose you to your board of directors." I lowered my champagne glass and leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom, calm and razor-sharp. "You want to talk about forgiveness?" I asked quietly. "Do you want to forgive me for the night you threw me out of your car on Highway 85 in the middle of a thunderstorm? I was 9 years old, and I got carsick on your new leather seats. I remember you laughing. I remember you placing bets with your friends on whether I would freeze to death before finding my way back to your house." The entire ballroom gasped collectively. The wealthy donors and politicians stared at Yvonne with absolute disgust. Yvonne lost her fake tears instantly. Her face turned pale as the elite society members she so desperately wanted to impress began pulling out their phones to record her. Trent lost his arrogant smirk. I signaled the head of security with a simple nod. "Escort these trespassers off the premises," I ordered through the microphone. "And if they resist, call the police." The guards grabbed Trent by the arms and physically dragged him toward the exit. Yvonne and Rochelle screamed and cursed as they were pulled out of the ballroom. As the heavy doors closed behind them, Trent yelled that I would regret this. I calmly adjusted my microphone and resumed my speech as if nothing had happened. But the war had officially begun. Later that night, I sat in the darkness of my penthouse looking at my glowing phone screen. I had 79 missed calls from unknown numbers and dozens of threatening voicemails. They thought they could intimidate me into handing over my money. They had no idea they had just walked right into a trap that I had been meticulously building for them. I smiled to myself as I placed the phone down. The revenge I planned would be absolute and devastating. The morning sunlight hit the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, but I felt nothing but cold focus. The 79 missed calls from the night before had multiplied into a barrage of notifications. Trent had not been making empty threats when he said he would use his media connections. By the time my driver pulled up to the glass facade of our building, the plaza was already swarming with local news vans and tabloid reporters. I stepped out of the vehicle and the flashing cameras immediately blinded me. Right in the center of the media circus stood my biological family. Rochelle was wearing a perfectly pressed designer dress that I knew for a fact she could not afford. She was dabbing her eyes with a tissue while a local reporter shoved a microphone in her face. "My sister is a monster," Rochelle cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. We came to her begging for help to save our mother from being thrown out on the street. "Valerie has millions of dollars, but she let security drag us out like dogs." She turned her back on her black family the second she got a taste of corporate wealth. Yvonne stood next to her, leaning heavily on Trent, playing the role of the frail and heartbroken mother. Trent looked straight into the camera, playing the protective white savior. "We just want to heal this family," Trent said, his tone dripping with fake sincerity. "Valerie has lost her way. There are serious questions about how she acquired her wealth and the dark money funding her firm. We are praying she does the right thing before the truth comes out." I walked past them without breaking my stride. Reporters shoved microphones toward my face, shouting questions about my mother and the fraud allegations. My security detail cleared a path, and I stepped through the revolving glass doors of my firm, leaving the circus behind. I did not show a single ounce of emotion, because in my world, showing emotion is the equivalent of bleeding in shark-infested waters. When I reached the executive floor, I did not even get the chance to sit at my desk. The receptionist informed me that the board of directors was already waiting for me in the main conference room. I walked in to find 5 of the most powerful investors in Atlanta staring at me with deep concern. The public relations nightmare was exactly what they hated most. "Valerie, this is becoming a massive liability," the senior partner said, tossing a tablet onto the table. "The local news is painting you as a ruthless predator who abandons her own mother. Trent is leveraging his tech industry contacts to spread rumors that our capital is funded by illicit offshore accounts. Clients are calling and asking questions." I took my seat at the table and folded my hands. "Trent is running a smear campaign because I refused to give him a $5 million loan last night," I explained calmly. "He is trying to extort this firm using my biological family as leverage." Another board member sighed and rubbed his temples. $5 million is a drop in the bucket for us, Valerie. Just give him the loan. Draft a strict repayment plan, but give him the money to make this go away. We can spin it as our firm supporting local minority families. It is a public relations win. Do not let your personal vendettas affect our bottom line." I looked at the men around the table. They wanted an easy way out. They wanted to pay the ransom. I refused to let my family win by using the exact same manipulation tactics they had used my entire life. "I am not giving Trent a single dime of our investors' money," I said, my voice steady and absolute. "I am asking this board for exactly 24 hours. Give me 24 hours, and I will not only make this public relations nightmare disappear, but I will hand this firm a highly lucrative asset that will double our quarterly projections." The board members exchanged skeptical glances. "You are playing a dangerous game, Valerie," the senior partner warned. "If you do not resolve this by tomorrow morning, we will have to ask for your resignation to protect the firm." "I accept those terms," I replied. I stood up and walked out of the conference room. My pulse was steady. I went straight to my office and told my assistant to send a formal invitation to Trent, Rochelle, and Yvonne. I invited them to a settlement meeting in the executive boardroom the following morning. I requested that the key shareholders sit in the viewing gallery. The trap was set. They thought they had cornered me by using the media to attack my reputation. They thought public shame would force me to open the company vault. They had no idea that I had spent the last 2 years tracking every single financial move Trent had ever made. The next morning, the atmosphere in the executive boardroom was electric with tension. The glass walls offered a clear view of the city skyline. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Yvonne, Rochelle, and Trent walked into the room acting as if they had already won the war. Trent strutted in like he owned the building. He tossed a glossy business plan onto the table right in front of me. "I told you the media would make you see reason," Valerie Trent said, leaning forward with a smug grin. "I am glad your board forced you to sit down with us. Now here are my terms for the $5 million loan. I want a reduced interest rate and a 5-year grace period before the first payment." Yvonne smiled proudly at Trent, then looked at me with disdain. "You should be thanking Trent for giving you a chance to clear your name," she said bitterly. "You have always been a stubborn and ungrateful child. You are lucky we are even willing to accept your money after what you did to us at the charity gala." Rochelle examined her manicured nails and sighed. "Just sign the paperwork, Valerie, so we can get out of here. You always have to make everything so difficult. You should be down on your knees begging for our forgiveness." I did not look at the business plan. I reached out and calmly pushed the glossy folder off the edge of the desk, letting it drop into the trash can. Trent blinked in confusion as his smug smile faltered. I picked up a remote control and turned off the main lights in the boardroom. The large projector screen behind me hummed to life. "I am not a loan officer, Trent," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "You do not qualify for our money. You do not even qualify to step foot in this building. But since you brought my mother and sister here to watch you secure your big victory, let me show you what you actually qualify for." I clicked the remote, and the first slide of my presentation illuminated their faces. The screen behind me glowed with complex financial graphs and bank routing numbers. I watched Trent as his eyes scanned the data. It took him exactly 4 seconds to realize what he was looking at. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him pale and sweating. "This is your business plan, Trent," I said, pointing at the screen. "Or rather, this is the true reality of your company. You do not build commercial real estate. You run a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. You have been taking millions from new investors simply to pay off the massive debts you owe to your original backers. You have zero actual revenue, and your entire operation is a house of cards waiting to collapse." Rochelle shifted in her expensive leather chair and let out a nervous laugh. She looked at her husband, expecting him to put me in my place. Trent stood up abruptly and slammed his hands on the mahogany table. He looked up at the shareholders in the viewing gallery and shouted that I was fabricating the data. He claimed I did not understand high-level tech real estate metrics and that I was just a bitter, estranged sister trying to ruin his pristine reputation out of sheer jealousy. I did not raise my voice. I did not even blink. I simply clicked the remote again to bring up the next slide. The new image displayed official property deeds and wire transfer logs. I turned my attention to my mother, who was still glaring at me with self-righteous anger. "You might want to pay close attention to this part, Yvonne," I said. "Because your golden son-in-law did not just steal from his corporate investors, he stole from you." The screen showed the official deed to the sprawling Atlanta mansion she constantly bragged about to her country club friends. Next to the deed were 3 separate loan agreements. Trent was desperate for cash to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat, I explained to the silent room. "So he forged your signature, Yvonne. He used your mansion as collateral to secure 3 separate mortgages. He took out millions of dollars against your home, and he lost every single penny of it in the market." Rochelle gasped loudly and covered her mouth with trembling hands. She looked at Trent, but he refused to meet her eyes. Yvonne shook her head violently side to side. She refused to believe the undeniable proof right in front of her. She slammed her hand on the desk and accused me of lying. She said Trent would never do such a terrible thing and that I was just a pathetic child trying to destroy my sister's perfect marriage. She yelled that I forged the documents because I was angry about being left on the highway all those years ago. Trent desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his suit jacket, trying to project an aura of absolute confidence. He forced a loud and hollow laugh that echoed through the glass boardroom. "None of your little presentation slides matter, Valerie," he said, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You think you have me cornered, but you are entirely wrong. I am untouchable." He announced to the room that my financial autopsy was completely irrelevant. He proudly declared that a massive and ruthless private equity firm out of New York had just stepped in to save him. He boasted that this New York firm had bought all of his debt earlier this week and was going to bail him out completely. He smirked and told me that he did not need my $5 million anymore because he had real powerful investors backing him now. I let his words hang in the air. I let him taste that false illusion of victory for just a few seconds longer. The shareholders in the gallery watched me closely, waiting for my final response. I smiled. It was a cold and terrifying smile that made Rochelle physically recoil in her chair. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen flashed with the corporate logo of the New York private equity firm that Trent had just praised so highly. Below the logo, the corporate hierarchy tree expanded outward, revealing the parent company. "The New York firm that bought your debt is a ghost subsidiary," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "It is entirely owned and operated by Dubois Capital. I did not bring you to my office today to give you a loan, Trent. I brought you here to look you in the eye and inform you that I am your sole creditor. I own your fraudulent company. I own all of your outstanding debt." I turned my gaze to my mother, who was now shaking uncontrollably in her seat. "And Yvonne, I own your house. Every single brick of that mansion belongs to me." The room went completely silent. The smug entitlement vanished from their faces, leaving nothing but pure terror. I picked up a thick stack of legal documents from my desk and pushed them across the table toward them. I signed the foreclosure notices and the asset seizure authorizations exactly 15 minutes ago, I said. "You have 48 hours to vacate my property." Trent went wild with panic. He lunged forward, screaming that I could not do this to him. He threatened to sue me and the entire firm, claiming that I had a legal obligation to support my family under some obscure law his cheap lawyers had mentioned. He screamed that he would destroy me in court. Yvonne collapsed out of her chair and fell to her knees, weeping uncontrollably. The woman who had proudly abandoned me on a stormy highway was now crawling on the floor, begging for my mercy. She grabbed the edge of my skirt, crying out that I was her flesh and blood and that I had to save her. At the exact same moment, I watched her reach into her designer purse to pull out her phone. She was secretly dialing emergency services, intending to falsely claim that I had physically assaulted her in the boardroom. Her manipulation knew no bounds, but I was already 10 steps ahead of her. I gestured to the security guards waiting by the glass doors. They stepped in immediately and confiscated her phone before the call could connect. The game was officially over, and they had lost absolutely everything. The very next morning, Trent decided to make good on his relentless threats. He was desperate and completely humiliated from the disaster in the executive boardroom, so he resorted to the only weapon he had left. He brought a swarm of trashy tabloid reporters and local news crews right into the gleaming marble lobby of Dubois Capital. The morning rush of corporate employees was entirely disrupted by the blinding flash of cameras and the shouting of aggressive journalists. Rochelle was the undeniable star of his pathetic and fabricated show. She stood in front of the high-definition cameras wearing a plain and inexpensive dress she probably borrowed just to look relatable and poor. She performed a tearful on-camera interview that belonged in a daytime soap opera. She sobbed uncontrollably while claiming that her multi-millionaire sister was a cold-blooded monster. She told the reporters that I had maliciously orchestrated a plan to steal our mother's home out of pure spite and deep-seated jealousy. Rochelle looked directly into the camera lens with mascara running down her cheeks, painting a picture of absolute despair. She wailed about how I was letting my own biological mother face homelessness and sleep on the streets of Atlanta. She painted a vivid picture of me as a ruthless corporate shark who had completely turned my back on my black family, the exact second I acquired a taste of corporate wealth. Trent stood right beside her, playing the role of the protective and deeply concerned husband. He looked at the reporters with a serious expression and told them that I was using dark offshore money to fund Dubois Capital. He claimed that my business practices were highly illegal and entirely predatory. He spun a ridiculous narrative that he was just a hard-working startup founder who had fallen victim to my aggressive financial traps. Yvonne was not going to miss an opportunity to be in the spotlight either. She arrived at the lobby wearing no makeup and leaning heavily on a cane that she absolutely did not need. She cried to a prominent local journalist about how she had prayed every night for 23 years for my safe return. She spun a fairy tale about a grieving mother who only wanted to reunite with her lost daughter, only for me to come back and ruthlessly destroy her life. She told the reporters that the mansion I was currently foreclosing on was filled with cherished family memories, and that throwing her out was an act of unforgivable cruelty. The local Atlanta news networks immediately picked up the story because it was the perfect sensational headline for their evening broadcasts. They plastered my face across every television screen in the city. The news anchors debated my ethics and questioned my loyalty to my community. Social media exploded with viral clips of Rochelle crying in my lobby. Thousands of strangers who knew absolutely nothing about my life were suddenly condemning me in the comment sections of every major platform. They called me a traitor, a sellout, and a soulless billionaire who forgot where she came from. Trent went even further by contacting financial bloggers and feeding them fabricated stories about my specific investment strategies. He claimed I deliberately targeted Black-owned businesses just to tear them down and absorb their assets for my own greedy gain. The narrative was meticulously designed to isolate me from my peers and destroy my credibility in the Atlanta business sector. He wanted to create so much overwhelming public pressure that I would be forced to drop the foreclosures and forgive his massive debts just to save my public image. I sat in my penthouse watching the news segments play on a loop. My phone was flooded with messages from wealthy acquaintances and business partners who were suddenly very concerned about their association with me. The public relations nightmare was escalating by the minute. The board of directors at Dubois Capital began sending urgent emails demanding emergency meetings to discuss the potential damage to our firm's reputation. They were panicking because the media was digging into our private equity acquisitions and framing our legitimate business practices as predatory attacks on vulnerable minority families. I did not panic. I did not issue a hasty press release or post a defensive statement on social media to protect myself. I knew that responding directly to their circus would only give them the validation and the platform they desperately craved. I simply watched them dig their own graves deeper and deeper with every lie they told the press. I instructed my security team to politely but firmly keep the press out of the upper floors of the building, ensuring that our daily operations continued without interruption. I told my assistant to forward all media inquiries to our legal department with a standard response of no comment at this time. The senior partners at my firm were terrified of the negative optics. They called me into another emergency meeting demanding that I fix the situation immediately before we lost major clients. They strongly suggested that I publicly apologize to my mother and offer her a generous financial settlement just to make the reporters go away. They argued that the negative press was causing our key investors to rethink their long-term commitments to our upcoming projects. I looked at the senior partners sitting around the table, and I absolutely refused to back down. I reminded them that the financial documents I held against Trent and Yvonne were ironclad, and that retreating now would only show weakness to the market. I told them that the storm would pass as soon as the real truth was revealed in a court of law. I stood my ground against the most powerful men in the firm, refusing to let a trashy tabloid campaign dictate my financial decisions or force me into surrendering my assets. I knew that Trent and Yvonne were playing a short-term game based on emotion, while I was playing a long-term game based on undeniable facts. I was willing to endure the temporary public hatred because I knew exactly how this story was going to end. The public spectacle continued for several days, with Rochelle making regular appearances on morning talk shows to cry about her ruined family. She hired a cheap publicist who booked her on any local network that would give her a microphone. Yvonne even started a crowdfunding campaign online begging strangers for money to save her historic family home from her cruel daughter. They were raking in sympathy donations and basking in the brief glow of local fame. Trent was using the distraction to quietly try and move what little money he had left into hidden accounts, but my legal team was already monitoring his every move. They were all so blinded by the flashing cameras and the sympathetic social media comments that they failed to realize they were providing me with endless documented evidence of public defamation. Every single interview they gave, every tear they faked, and every lie they broadcasted was being meticulously recorded by my attorneys. I let them enjoy their media circus, because I knew the courtroom would not be swayed by cheap tabloid theatrics. The fallout from their media circus reached the highest levels of Dubois' capital faster than I had anticipated. It was barely noon when my desk phone buzzed with a direct line from the executive suite. My assistant walked into my office, her face pale, and informed me that the board of directors had convened an emergency session. They requested my immediate presence. I knew exactly what this was about. I stood up, smoothed the lines of my tailored suit, and walked down the glass corridor toward the main boardroom. The silence in the hallway was deafening. Junior analysts and associates averted their eyes as I passed them. The rumors had already infected the building. Trent had done a thorough job of planting whispers in the ears of financial bloggers, and those whispers had morphed into a roaring storm. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom and stepped inside. Sitting around the massive oval table were the 7 principal shareholders of the firm. These were men and women who controlled billions of dollars in assets. They were risk-averse, calculating, and entirely allergic to bad public relations. The chairman of the board, a silver-haired man who had mentored me early in my career, sat at the head of the table. His expression was grim. The large flat-screen television on the wall was muted, but I could clearly see the local news playing a loop of Rochelle crying outside our building. "Take a seat, Valerie," the chairman said, his voice tight with frustration. I sat down and folded my hands on the cool, polished wood of the table. The board did not waste any time with pleasantries. A senior partner from the risk management division tossed a thick stack of printed articles and blog posts across the table toward me. They accused me of bringing a catastrophic level of negative attention to Dubois Capital. The partner pointed at the papers and said that Trent was spreading highly damaging allegations. Trent had convinced the press that I used dark offshore money to secure my partnership at the firm. He was spinning a narrative that my entire portfolio was built on illegal funds and predatory lending practices targeting minority communities. "The accusations of dark money are completely baseless and entirely fabricated," I stated calmly, keeping my gaze steady. "You all have full access to my financial disclosures, and you know exactly how clean my portfolio is. I have generated record profits for this firm through aggressive but entirely legal acquisitions." Another board member, a woman who usually supported my aggressive tactics, slammed her palm on the table. "The truth does not matter right now, Valerie," she said sharply. "What matters is the optics. Our institutional investors are calling us in a panic. They do not want their portfolios associated with a rogue partner who is currently being crucified on local television for allegedly throwing her poor black mother out onto the streets. The optics are toxic, and this firm cannot afford to bleed major clients over your petty family drama." The chairman leaned forward and folded his hands, mirroring my posture. He told me that the board had reached a consensus before I even walked into the room. They wanted this problem to disappear immediately. They demanded that I settle this dispute quietly and quickly. The chairman instructed me to approve the $5 million loan that Trent was demanding. He told me to structure it as a high-risk venture capital investment if I had to, but he insisted that I give Trent the money to make the media circus stop. They wanted me to release a joint public statement with my family, claiming that it was all a simple misunderstanding, and that Dubois Capital was proudly supporting a local minority-owned real estate startup. They were asking me to surrender. They wanted me to hand over $5 million of the firm's money to a con artist just to appease the local tabloids and protect our public image. They wanted me to bow down to the very people who had abused me, abandoned me, and were now actively trying to extort me. I looked around the table at these powerful executives, and I felt a cold, absolute certainty settle in my chest. "I am not giving Trent a single dollar," I said, my voice ringing clear and authoritative in the silent room. "I will not authorize a fraudulent loan to quiet down a tabloid smear campaign, and I will certainly not reward extortion." The boardroom erupted in immediate anger. The senior partner yelled that I was being arrogant and reckless. He threatened that if I did not comply, they would vote to suspend me pending an internal investigation into the dark money rumors. He warned me that I was risking my entire career and my equity in the firm over a stubborn refusal to pay a small ransom. I waited for the shouting to die down. I did not break eye contact with the chairman. "I understand your concerns about the optics," I said smoothly. "But paying off a blackmailer only invites more blackmail. Trent does not want to build a business. He wants to drain our resources to cover his own catastrophic failures. If you force me to give him that $5 million, you will be funding a verified Ponzi scheme, and when the federal investigators inevitably uncover his fraud, Dubois Capital will be directly implicated in his crimes." The board members froze. The mention of federal investigators and a Ponzi scheme immediately caught their attention. The chairman narrowed his eyes and asked me to explain exactly what I meant. I took a deep breath and laid out my terms. "I am asking this board for exactly 24 hours, I said. "Give me 24 hours to not only clear my name and permanently silence these ridiculous dark money rumors, but to bring this firm a highly lucrative asset. I have spent the last 2 years tracking Trent's financial operations. He is drowning in debt, and his entire commercial real estate startup is a facade. He has severely over-leveraged highly valuable properties, including a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead." The room was entirely silent now. The anger had been replaced by a sharp, predatory curiosity. I continued my proposal, knowing exactly how to appeal to their relentless greed. "If you let me handle this my way, I will completely destroy his credibility in the press, and I will legally absorb all of his remaining assets into our portfolio for a fraction of their actual market value. I will turn this public relations nightmare into one of the most profitable liquidations this firm has executed all year. But I need you to back off and let me execute my strategy without interference." The chairman looked at the other board members. They communicated in silent glances, weighing the massive risk of the media fallout against the potential reward of a highly lucrative asset seizure. They were sharks, and I was offering them blood in the water. The chairman turned his attention back to me and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You have 24 hours, Valerie," the chairman said, his voice deadly serious. 24 hours to make this go away and bring us the assets you just promised. If this media circus is still outside our building by tomorrow afternoon, we will terminate your partnership and freeze your accounts. Do not fail us." I stood up from the table, my posture perfect and my expression unreadable. "I will not fail," I replied. I walked out of the boardroom with my career on the line and a ticking clock hanging over my head. But I was not afraid. I had exactly what I needed. I walked straight to my assistant and told her to send a formal meeting invitation to Trent, Rochelle, and Yvonne. I requested their presence in our executive glass boardroom the following morning. The trap was fully set, and it was time to let them walk right into their own destruction. The morning arrived with a crisp chill that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside the Dubois Capital executive boardroom. This room was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, designed specifically to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a dizzying view of the Atlanta skyline, but the real pressure came from the viewing gallery suspended just above the main table. Behind a layer of tinted soundproof glass sat the principal shareholders of the firm. They were the same men and women who had threatened to end my career just 24 hours ago. Now they were silent spectators, waiting to see if I could deliver the highly lucrative asset I had promised. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table wearing a charcoal suit. I kept my posture perfectly rigid and my expression entirely blank. My hands were folded neatly over a single manila folder. The trap was primed. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. Trent clearly walked in first, leading the way with a swagger that bordered on comical. He was wearing a flashy navy suit that screamed new money and absolute desperation. Right behind him came Rochelle and Yvonne. They looked like they had just won the lottery. Rochelle had swapped her cheap, relatable dress from the news interviews for a glaringly expensive outfit. She carried a designer handbag that I knew for a fact was maxing out at least 2 of her credit cards. Yvonne walked confidently, without the cane she had used to garner sympathy from the cameras yesterday. Her miraculous recovery was a true testament to her sheer audacity and manipulative nature. They walked into my boardroom not as guests, but as conquerors who truly believed they had brought a titan to its knees. They glanced up at the tinted glass of the viewing gallery, but they did not care who was watching them. They assumed the shadowy figures were just my angry bosses waiting to force me into a humiliating surrender. Trent did not wait to be offered a seat. He pulled out the chair directly opposite me and sat down heavily, spreading his arms out as if he owned the entire building. Rochelle and Yvonne took their seats flanking him, like loyal subjects to a deeply delusional king. Trent reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, glossy folder. He tossed it across the polished mahogany table with an incredibly arrogant flick of his wrist. The folder slid across the smooth wood and stopped just inches from my folded hands. It was his business plan. The physical manifestation of his failing Ponzi scheme dressed up in expensive binding. "I told you the media would make you see reason, Valerie," he said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. "It is a massive shame we had to do it the hard way, but I am glad your board finally forced you to sit down with us. The local news really did a spectacular number on your reputation yesterday, did they not?" He chuckled softly, a sound that grated against the absolute silence of the room. I did not look down at the glossy folder. I kept my eyes locked directly on Trent's face, maintaining a deadpan stare. He took my silence as a clear sign of submission and weakness. "Now that we are all on the same page," Trent continued, "let us talk about the terms of my bailout. Since your firm desperately needs a public relations win to stop the bleeding, I have decided to do you a massive favor. I will accept your $5 million investment, but I am not going to take it under your standard predatory terms. You need my black-owned family business to make your dark money rumors disappear. So here is exactly how this is going to work. I want the $5 million transferred into my primary operating account by the end of business today. I also demand a significantly lower interest rate because your usual numbers are completely insulting. I want a flat 2% interest rate, and I'm going to need a full 5-year grace period before I make a single repayment." He spoke with such unearned conviction that it was almost fascinating to watch a man dig his own grave. He truly believed he held all the power in the room. Yvonne leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and triumph. "You should be thanking Trent for giving you a chance to clear your name," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You have always been a stubborn, ungrateful child, Valerie. You brought this entire disaster upon yourself when you had your security team throw us out of your fancy little party. You are incredibly lucky we are even willing to accept your dirty money after how you treated your own flesh and blood." Rochelle examined her perfect manicure and let out a dramatic sigh. "Just sign the paperwork, Valerie," she added lazily. "You always have to make everything so difficult. We have a press conference scheduled for noon to announce that Dubois Capital is funding our family business. Do not ruin this for yourself. You should be down on your knees begging for our forgiveness right now." I let their words hang in the heavy air of the boardroom. They had spoken exactly as I hoped they would, performing their arrogance perfectly for the invisible audience watching from above. They thought they were dictating terms to a defeated employee. but they were actually confessing their extortion directly to the principal shareholders of Dubois Capital. The silence stretched out for several long seconds. Trent tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest, waiting for me to break. I slowly unclasped my hands and reached out toward his pristine business plan. The moment of absolute destruction had finally arrived. It was time to spring the trap. I did not reach for the pen that Trent had so presumptuously slid across the table toward me. Instead, I let my hands rest on the smooth mahogany surface and allowed them to continue digging their own graves. Yvonne took my silence as an invitation to keep speaking. She leaned back in her plush leather chair and crossed her arms, looking at me with a mixture of disgust and misplaced pride. She began to talk about Trent as if he were some kind of financial messiah who had descended from the heavens to save our family from my supposed failures. She told me that I had absolutely no idea how business in the real world actually worked. She said that while I was busy sitting in a glass tower playing with other people's money, Trent was out in the streets building a tangible empire with his bare hands. She called him a visionary and a genius of the real estate market. She praised his aggressive expansion strategies and claimed that his intellect was entirely wasted on someone like me, who only understood how to read a boring spreadsheet. Yvonne sneered and said that I was nothing more than a glorified secretary in a fancy suit who had gotten lucky by riding the coattails of powerful men. She told me that I should be taking notes from a real entrepreneur instead of trying to sabotage him out of my own bitter insecurity and lingering childhood jealousy. Rochelle chimed in right on cue, exactly as she always did when we were younger. She let out a condescending little laugh and flipped her expensive hair over her shoulder. She looked around my massive boardroom with an unimpressed expression, as if she were inspecting a cheap roadside motel room. She told me that I was acting incredibly selfish and that my behavior over the past 2 days had been completely humiliating for the family name. Rochelle smirked and said that I should be deeply grateful they were even willing to sit in the same room with me after the dramatic stunt I pulled at the charity gala. She claimed that any other family would have cut me off entirely and left me to rot in my own misery. She leaned forward and tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the table, demanding that I stop wasting their valuable time with my silent treatment. She told me to drop the tough girl act, just sign the loan approval and wire the $5 million so they could get back to running a real business while I went back to crunching numbers for my bosses. Trent nodded, along with every insulting word his wife and mother-in-law threw at me. His chest was puffed out with sheer arrogance and unearned confidence. He truly believed that he had orchestrated a masterclass in corporate extortion. He looked up at the tinted glass of the viewing gallery, completely oblivious to the fact that the principal shareholders of Dubois Capital were currently listening to every single ridiculous demand he made. He thought he had me backed into a corner where my only option was to surrender my dignity and hand over the firm's money to save my public reputation from his tabloid smear campaign. He pointed to the glossy business plan sitting in front of me and told me to open it. He said that if I actually bothered to read his brilliant financial projections, I would realize that he was doing me a massive favor by allowing Dubois Capital to fund his startup. I looked at the three of them sitting there bathing in their collective delusion. They had built a complete alternate reality where they were the absolute victims and the heroic saviors all at once, while I was just a stepping stone for their endless greed. They thought my silence was the silence of a defeated woman. They did not realize it was the silence of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I slowly extended my right hand toward the thick, glossy folder containing his business plan. Trent smirked, expecting me to open it and begin reviewing his fabricated numbers like a good little obedient employee. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the folder. I did not open it. I did not even glance down at the cover. Instead, I maintained deadpan eye contact with Trent and slowly pushed the folder across the polished wood. It slid smoothly off the edge of the massive table and fell directly into the metal trash can positioned near my chair. The heavy thud of the binder hitting the bottom of the empty bin echoed loudly in the completely silent boardroom. Trent dropped his smug smile instantly. His face contorted in sudden confusion and rapidly rising anger. He started to stand up, his mouth opening to demand what I thought I was doing and how dare I disrespect his work. Rochelle let out a sharp gasp of pure indignation, and Yvonne slammed her hands flat on the table, looking as though she was about to start screaming about my lack of respect for my elders. Before any of them could form a single, coherent sentence, I picked up the small silver remote control resting next to my keyboard. I pressed a single button. The heavy automated blackout blinds instantly descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, shutting out the bright Atlanta skyline and plunging the room into a deep, heavy shadow. The main overhead lights dimmed to a very low hum. I pressed another button, and the massive high-definition projector screen dropped down from the ceiling directly behind my chair. It hummed to life, casting a harsh, bright white glow across the faces of my mother, my sister, and the man who thought he could extort me. They sat frozen in their chairs, completely disoriented by the sudden physical shift in the environment. The power dynamic in the room had just violently reversed itself, and they were finally beginning to realize that they were not the ones in control. I folded my hands back together on the empty space of the table where his ridiculous business plan had been sitting just seconds ago. I looked directly at Trent, my voice dropping to a low, calm, and completely merciless tone. "I am not alone, Officer Trent," I said. The sound of my voice cut through the dark room like a surgical blade. "You do not qualify for our money. You do not even come close to meeting the basic requirements to borrow a single cent from this firm. You are a massive liability and an absolute fraud." Trent opened his mouth to protest, to yell something about his media contacts, but I did not let him speak. I clicked the remote to bring up the first slide of my presentation. "But since you brought your entire audience here today," I continued, my eyes locking onto his pale, sweating face, "let me show you what you do qualify for." The screen behind me glowed with complex financial graphs and bank routing numbers. I watched Trent as his eyes scanned the data. It took him exactly 4 seconds to realize what he was looking at. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him pale and sweating. "This is your business plan, Trent," I said, pointing at the screen. "Or rather, this is the true reality of your company. You do not build commercial real estate. You run a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. You have been taking millions from new investors simply to pay off the massive debts you owe to your original backers. You have zero actual revenue, and your entire operation is a house of cards waiting to collapse." Rochelle shifted in her expensive leather chair and let out a nervous laugh. She looked at her husband, expecting him to put me in my place. Trent stood up abruptly and slammed his hands on the mahogany table. He looked up at the shareholders in the viewing gallery and shouted that I was fabricating the data. He claimed I did not understand high-level tech real estate metrics and that I was just a bitter, estranged sister trying to ruin his pristine reputation out of sheer jealousy. I did not raise my voice. I did not even blink. I simply clicked the remote again to bring up the next slide. The new image displayed official property deeds and wire transfer logs. I turned my attention to my mother, who was still glaring at me with self-righteous anger. "You might want to pay close attention to this part, Yvonne," I said. "Because your golden son-in-law did not just steal from his corporate investors. He stole from you." The screen showed the official deed to the sprawling Atlanta mansion she constantly bragged about to her country club friends. Next to the deed were 3 separate loan agreements. Trent was desperate for cash to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat, I explained to the silent room. "So he forged your signature, Yvonne. He used your mansion as collateral to secure 3 separate mortgages. He took out millions of dollars against your home, and he lost every single penny of it in the market." Rochelle gasped loudly and covered her mouth with trembling hands. She looked at Trent, but he refused to meet her eyes. Yvonne shook her head violently side to side. She refused to believe the undeniable proof right in front of her. She slammed her hand on the desk and accused me of lying. She said Trent would never do such a terrible thing and that I was just a pathetic child trying to destroy my sister's perfect marriage. She yelled that I forged the documents because I was angry about being left on the highway all those years ago. Trent desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his suit jacket, trying to project an aura of absolute confidence. He forced a loud and hollow laugh that echoed through the glass boardroom. "None of your little presentation slides matter, Valerie," he said, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You think you have me cornered, but you are entirely wrong. I am untouchable." He announced to the room that my financial autopsy was completely irrelevant. He proudly declared that a massive and ruthless private equity firm out of New York had just stepped in to save him. He boasted that this New York firm had bought all of his debt earlier this week and was going to bail him out completely. He smirked and told me that he did not need my $5 million anymore because he had real powerful investors backing him now. I let his words hang in the air. I let him taste that false illusion of victory for just a few seconds longer. The shareholders in the gallery watched me closely, waiting for my final response. I smiled. It was a cold and terrifying smile that made Rochelle physically recoil in her chair. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen flashed with the corporate logo of the New York private equity firm that Trent had just praised so highly. Below the logo, the corporate hierarchy tree expanded outward, revealing the parent company. "The New York firm that bought your debt is a ghost subsidiary," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "It is entirely owned and operated by Dubois Capital. I did not bring you to my office today to give you a loan, Trent. I brought you here to look you in the eye and inform you that I am your sole creditor. I own your fraudulent company. I own all of your outstanding debt." I turned my gaze to my mother, who was now shaking uncontrollably in her seat. "And Yvonne, I own your house. Every single brick of that mansion belongs to me." The room went completely silent. The smug entitlement vanished from their faces, leaving nothing but pure terror. I picked up a thick stack of legal documents from my desk and pushed them across the table toward them. I signed the foreclosure notices and the asset seizure authorizations exactly 15 minutes ago, I said. "You have 48 hours to vacate my property." Trent went wild with panic. He lunged forward, screaming that I could not do this to him. He threatened to sue me and the entire firm, claiming that I had a legal obligation to support my family under some obscure law his cheap lawyers had mentioned. He screamed that he would destroy me in court. Yvonne collapsed out of her chair and fell to her knees, weeping uncontrollably. The woman who had proudly abandoned me on a stormy highway was now crawling on the floor, begging for my mercy. She grabbed the edge of my skirt, crying out that I was her flesh and blood and that I had to save her. At the exact same moment, I watched her reach into her designer purse to pull out her phone. She was secretly dialing emergency services, intending to falsely claim that I had physically assaulted her in the boardroom. Her manipulation knew no bounds, but I was already 10 steps ahead of her. I gestured to the security guards waiting by the glass doors. They stepped in immediately and confiscated her phone before the call could connect. The game was officially over, and they had lost absolutely everything. The laser pointer in my hand was perfectly steady as I circled the staggering negative numbers on the projector screen. The red dot danced over the massive deficits that Trent had desperately tried to hide from his investors, his wife, and his mother-in-law. But I was not finished dissecting his fraudulent empire. I clicked the remote again, and the screen transitioned to a new slide. This one did not feature complex corporate graphs or banking routes. It displayed high-resolution scans of official county real estate documents. I turned my attention directly to Yvonne. She was sitting rigidly in her chair, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "You might want to pay very close attention to this part, Yvonne," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, dangerous register. "Because your golden son-in-law did not just steal from faceless corporate investors. He stole from you." The screen illuminated the official deed to the sprawling Atlanta mansion in Buckhead, the very same mansion Yvonne constantly bragged about to her elite country club friends. The mansion was her crown jewel, her ultimate proof that she had made it into high society after she discarded me on the highway. But right next to the deed were 3 separate, heavily redacted loan agreements. Trent was desperate for cash to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat, I explained, projecting my voice so every syllable reached the viewing gallery above us. He was bleeding money every single day, and his original backers were demanding their returns. So he did what any desperate cornered fraudster would do. He forged your signature, Yvonne. He used your pristine mansion as collateral to secure 3 separate high-risk mortgages from shadow lenders. He took out millions of dollars against your home without your knowledge, and he lost every single penny of it trying to cover his tracks in the market. Rochelle gasped loudly. The sound ripped through the quiet boardroom like a gunshot. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes wide with sudden absolute terror. She whipped her head around to look at Trent, expecting him to immediately deny it, expecting him to laugh it off and call me a liar. But Trent refused to meet her eyes. He stared down at the polished mahogany table, his jaw clenched tight, a vein throbbing in his neck. His silence was a deafening confession. Yvonne shook her head violently from side to side. Her carefully constructed reality was cracking, but her deeply ingrained denial fought back with vicious intensity. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the table, leaning forward with her teeth bared. She refused to believe the undeniable legal proof displayed right in front of her face. "That is a lie!" Yvonne shouted, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. "That is a filthy, disgusting lie, Valerie. Trent would never do such a terrible thing to me. He is a good man. He is a brilliant businessman. He is family. You are just fabricating these documents because you are a pathetic, jealous child trying to destroy your sister's perfect marriage." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "I did not fabricate anything, Yvonne," I replied calmly. "These are public records filed with the county clerk's office. You can verify them yourself with a simple phone call. Trent forged your signature on the power of attorney documents, and he walked away with millions. Your mansion is currently leveraged to the absolute limit. You do not own that house anymore, Yvonne. The bank owns it." Rochelle's panic escalated into a frantic, desperate denial. She grabbed Trent's arm, shaking him, trying to force him to speak. "Tell her she is lying," Trent Rochelle pleaded, her voice breaking. "Tell her you did not touch the house. Tell her this is just another one of her vindictive games." Trent finally looked up, but he did not look at Rochelle. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. His face was flushed a deep, angry red. He puffed out his chest and violently adjusted his suit jacket, trying to project an aura of absolute confidence that he no longer possessed. He forced a loud, hollow laugh that echoed through the glass boardroom, sounding incredibly forced and unnatural. "None of your little presentation slides matter, Valerie," he said, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you have me cornered with these fake documents, but you are entirely wrong. You are so out of your depth it is pathetic. I am untouchable." He stood up from his chair, turning his back on his hyperventilating wife and his horrified mother-in-law. He announced to the room and to the invisible shareholders watching from the gallery that my financial autopsy was completely irrelevant. He proudly declared that I was a day late and a dollar short. He claimed that a massive and ruthless private equity firm out of New York had already stepped in to save him from his temporary liquidity issues. He boasted that this New York firm had bought all of his outstanding debt earlier this week. He claimed they recognized his true genius and were going to bail him out completely, restructuring his entire portfolio. He smirked a sickening, arrogant smile and told me that he did not need my $5 million anymore. He said he only came to the meeting today to watch me humiliate myself because he had real powerful investors backing him. Now investors who operated on a level I could not even comprehend. I let his arrogant words hang in the air. I let him taste that false illusion of victory. For just a few seconds longer, the shareholders in the gallery watched me closely, waiting for my final response to his grand declaration of immunity. I smiled. It was a cold, calculating, and terrifying smile that made Rochelle physically recoil in her chair. She recognized that smile. It was the same smile I had the night they left me on Highway 85, the smile of a girl who had already figured out how to survive. Trent paced back and forth across the plush carpet of the executive boardroom, his chest puffed out with desperate pride. He stopped pacing and leaned heavily against his chair, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He told the room that my little presentation was nothing more than a pathetic attempt to scare him. He bragged that while I was busy digging through public records, he was taking meetings with actual titans of Wall Street. He raised his hands and described the massive private equity firm out of New York. He called them ruthless predators of the financial sector who operated on a level of sophistication that Dubois' Capital could never hope to achieve. He claimed these investors had independently audited his portfolio and instantly recognized his genius. They saw the minor cash flow issues as a temporary hiccup. Trent boasted that they had aggressively bought out all of his outstanding debt just 3 days ago and were preparing to inject millions in fresh capital to take his startup public. I watched him spin his intricate web of lies and delusions. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, completely unaware that the very people he was trying to impress were sitting behind the tinted glass of the viewing gallery, quietly observing his absolute foolishness. He smoothed his expensive tie and laughed a loud, booming sound that was meant to project dominance, but only highlighted his deep-seated panic. He told me that he was untouchable now. He claimed that his new financial partners were so powerful and so deeply entrenched in the global market that they would crush anyone who tried to stand in their way. He looked me dead in the eye and said that I had completely missed my window of opportunity. He told me that I could have been part of a historic financial takeover if I had just given him the loan, but now I was going to be left in the dust watching him build a dynasty. The sheer audacity of his delusion was almost intoxicating to witness. He had convinced himself that a group of faceless billionaires had descended from the sky to reward his fraudulent behavior. The magical New York firm was his ultimate shield, and he wielded it like a weapon. Yvonne latched onto his words like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. The stark terror that had paralyzed her completely vanished. The undeniable proof of her forged signature and the triple mortgage on her beloved Buckhead mansion were instantly forgotten. Her desperate need to maintain her facade of wealth and superiority overpowered her survival instincts. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief and pressed her hand against her chest. She looked at Trent with eyes full of absolute worship and adoration. She praised him for being so resourceful and so brilliant. She said that she always knew he was destined for greatness, and that a temporary financial restructuring was just a normal part of doing high-level business. She turned her attention back to me, her face twisting into a mask of pure contempt. She claimed my jealousy was a sickness that had poisoned my mind. Yvonne proudly declared that the forged signatures on her house deed were probably just a minor administrative oversight that the New York firm would clean up immediately. She actually justified the theft of her own home because the illusion of being associated with a powerful Wall Street firm was more important to her than the actual truth. Rochelle was quick to join the chorus of delusion. The tears of panic dried instantly as she sat up straight and smoothed the wrinkles from her designer dress. She looked at me with a smug smirk that perfectly mirrored her husband's arrogance. She told me that I was a pathetic joke. She laughed out loud and said that while I was sitting in my glass office in Atlanta pretending to be a big shot, her husband was doing incredibly lucrative deals with the real masters of the financial universe. She boasted that they were going to be richer than ever before, and that I would never ever be invited to any of their exclusive high society galas. They were continuously feeding off each other's wild delusions, creating an impenetrable echo chamber of supreme arrogance. Trent continued to monologue, talking down to me as if I were a misguided child who did not understand basic economics. He tried to explain corporate restructuring using buzzwords he had clearly memorized from financial magazines but did not actually comprehend. He promised that when his company went public, he would make sure the media knew exactly how Dubois Capital had failed to recognize his potential. I did not interrupt him. I did not correct his mispronunciation of basic financial terms or challenge his ridiculous claims about the New York firm. I sat in my chair perfectly still and let him talk. I let the silence of my response validate his ego. I allowed Yvonne to hurl her insults, and I allowed Rochelle to bask in her fabricated victory. The shareholders watching from the gallery above were completely silent. They were watching a man who had defrauded his investors, forged his mother-in-law's signature, and leveraged his entire existence on a phantom savior. Trent stopped pacing and stood at the opposite end of the mahogany table. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the wood. He gave me one final look of absolute triumph. He told me that this meeting was over and that he was going to walk out of my building a victorious man. He said that he would be waiting for my formal public apology for the inconvenience I had caused his family. He truly believed he had won. He believed the illusion was real. He had no idea that the massive, ruthless private equity firm out of New York that he worshipped so deeply was about to become his ultimate executioner. Trent stood at the end of the mahogany table, chest heaving with exertion after his impassioned speech about his untouchable status. He was waiting for me to surrender, to admit defeat, and to acknowledge that he had outmaneuvered me on every level. Rochelle sat up straighter, her face glowing with a toxic combination of relief and vindictive satisfaction. Yvonne let out a long, dramatic exhale, pressing her hand to her chest, as if she had just narrowly escaped a burning building. They were all convinced that this New York firm was their ultimate salvation. The divine intervention that would allow them to maintain their wealthy facade while completely destroying me in the process. I let their fragile sense of victory linger for exactly 5 seconds. I wanted them to savor the taste of it, to feel the absolute certainty of their triumph, because I knew the fall would be that much more devastating. The executives in the viewing gallery shifted slightly, the only sound in the dead-silent boardroom. They were waiting for the kill. I picked up the small silver remote resting on the table. My hand was perfectly steady. I did not break eye contact with Trent. My expression remained completely devoid of emotion, an impenetrable mask that offered them zero comfort. The smile that finally touched my lips was not born of joy or amusement. It was a cold, terrifying curve of the mouth that made Rochelle's triumphant expression falter instantly. It was the smile of a predator that had patiently guided its prey directly into an inescapable snare. I clicked the remote one final time. The projector hummed and the screen behind me shifted, illuminating the dark boardroom with a blinding white light. The logo of the massive, ruthless private equity firm out of New York flashed onto the screen. It was the exact firm Trent had just spent the last 10 minutes worshipping, the firm he claimed had recognized his brilliant entrepreneurial genius and bought all of his debt. Below their impressive corporate logo, a complex organizational chart began to expand outward, branching into various subsidiaries and shell companies. The lines connected, moving upward, tracing the money back to its original source. The final line connected the New York firm directly to the parent company. The logo that appeared at the very top of the hierarchy tree was undeniable and absolute. Dubois Capital. The boardroom was engulfed in a silence so profound it felt suffocating. Trent stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with a frantic, terrified confusion. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear his vision, hoping the logo would magically change. He looked back at me, his chest no longer puffed out, his arrogant posture instantly collapsing. Rochelle stopped smoothing her expensive dress, her hands freezing midair. Yvonne let out a small, strangled gasp, her eyes darting frantically between the projector screen and my face. The reality of the situation crashed into them with the force of a freight train. I folded my hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. My voice when I spoke was low, calm, and absolutely merciless. "The New York firm that bought your debt is a ghost subsidiary," I said. Every single word was articulated with lethal precision. "It is entirely owned, funded, and operated by Dubois Capital. They did not buy your debt because they recognized your genius, Trent. They bought your debt because I authorized the acquisition. I instructed them to purchase every single outstanding loan, every line of credit, and every forged mortgage you hold." Trent gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was a man drowning in the sudden terrifying realization of his own destruction. Yvonne began to shake, her entire body trembling as the implications of my words washed over her. Rochelle stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrific dawning comprehension. "I did not bring you to my office today to give you a loan. Trent?" I continued, my voice echoing in the glass-walled room. "I did not bring you here to negotiate an interest rate or to beg for a public relations truce. I brought you here to look you in the eye and inform you that I am your sole creditor. I own your fraudulent company. I own your failing real estate projects. I own every single cent of your outstanding debt." I turned my gaze, slowly transferring the full weight of my attention to my mother. She shrank back in her plush leather chair, her face pale and drawn. "And Yvonne," I said, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper, "I own your house. Every single brick of that sprawling Buckhead mansion belongs to me. You let Trent triple mortgage your home to fund a Ponzi scheme, and I am the one who holds all three of those deeds." The smug entitlement that had defined their existence for decades vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. They were no longer the arrogant victors dictating terms to a defeated employee. They were prisoners, trapped in a glass box, entirely at my mercy. I reached over to a thick stack of legal documents resting on the corner of my desk. The crisp white paper contrasted sharply against the dark mahogany wood. I placed my hand flat on top of the stack and pushed them slowly across the table until they stopped directly in front of Trent. I signed the foreclosure notices and the asset seizure authorizations exactly 15 minutes ago. I said, the finality of my words sealing their fate. The legal process has already been initiated. The banks have been notified, and the accounts have been frozen. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property before the sheriff arrives to forcibly remove you. The game is over and you have lost absolutely everything. 2 weeks passed, and the inevitable backlash began. Trent and Yvonne were completely cornered, their carefully constructed illusions shattered into a million pieces. They were facing the absolute reality of losing their precious mansion and the fraudulent business that funded their lavish lifestyle. Their desperation mutated into a frantic, vicious retaliation. They could not accept that I had outsmarted them, so they resorted to the only tactic they had left. They dragged me into the Atlanta Commercial Court. They filed an emergency injunction to block the foreclosure of the Buckhead mansion and to halt the asset seizure of Trent's failing commercial real estate startup. The legal documents were a masterpiece of fabricated victimhood. They did not stop at simply contesting the foreclosures. They launched a full-scale offensive, suing me for familial support and emotional damages. They were demanding millions of dollars, claiming that my actions had caused severe psychological trauma and irreparable harm to the family unit. I walked into the courtroom on a rainy Tuesday morning, flanked by my top-tier legal team from Dubois Capital. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The courtroom was sparsely populated, but the tension was palpable. Yvonne, Rochelle, and Trent sat at the plaintiff's table, their postures stiff and defensive. They had hired a notoriously sleazy local attorney named Richardson. He was a man known for his theatrical courtroom performances and his complete disregard for legal ethics. He specialized in spinning sensational narratives to manipulate judges and juries. Richardson stood up as the proceedings began, adjusting his cheap suit jacket and clearing his throat loudly. He launched into a dramatic opening statement, painting a picture of a cruel, unfeeling daughter who had amassed unimaginable wealth and was now using it to systematically destroy her vulnerable, aging mother. He paced back and forth in front of the judge, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion. "Your Honor!" Richardson began, pointing a dramatic finger toward me. "We are here today to stop a ruthless corporate execution. My client, Yvonne Dubois, is a devoted mother who has spent her entire life sacrificing for her family. She welcomed her daughter Valerie back into her life with open arms, only to be met with a cold, calculated campaign of financial destruction. Valerie Dubois has used her massive corporate resources to illegally acquire the debt on my client's family home and her son-in-law's business, all out of sheer spite and deep-seated childhood resentment. Yvonne dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. Rochelle sat beside her, looking appropriately distressed. Trent glared at me, his jaw clenched tight, trying to project an air of righteous indignation. Richardson continued his theatrical performance, pacing the length of the courtroom. He argued that I had a moral and legal obligation to provide familial support for my aging mother, especially considering my vast personal wealth. He cited an obscure, archaic Georgia law, attempting to twist it into a mandate that I must pay Yvonne alimony for the rest of her life to compensate for the emotional distress I had supposedly caused her. He claimed that my foreclosure notices were not a legitimate business action, but a malicious act of domestic terrorism designed to render my family homeless. My lead attorney, a brilliant strategist named Marcus, calmly stood up when Richardson finally finished his ridiculous monologue. Marcus did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed a thick stack of verified financial documents onto the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady and commanding, "the opposing counsel's entire argument is built on a foundation of proven financial fraud. My client, Valerie Dubois, is a partner at Dubois Capital. She authorized the legal acquisition of Trent Blackwood's outstanding corporate debt and the 3 mortgages on Yvonne Dubois' estate. These acquisitions were executed perfectly within the bounds of commercial law." Marcus pulled out the official property deed for the Buckhead Mansion and the 3 separate loan agreements. He directed the judge's attention to the signatures. "As you can clearly see, Your Honor," Marcus continued, "Trent Blackwood forged his mother-in-law's signature to secure millions of dollars in high-risk loans. He used her home as collateral to fund a verified Ponzi scheme. My client is not destroying her family. She is simply acting as the sole legal creditor and executing a standard asset seizure on deeply defaulted loans. The opposing counsel is attempting to use the courtroom to extort my client and shield his clients from the consequences of their own federal crimes." Trent's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He leaned over and whispered frantically to Richardson, his panic becoming visible. Yvonne gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. She had expected the judge to immediately side with her, to see her as the poor, victimized mother. She did not expect her golden son-in-law's massive fraud to be laid out so clearly in a court of law. Richardson scrambled to object, claiming that the fraud allegations were entirely separate from the issue of familial support and the emergency injunction. He argued that regardless of how the debt was acquired, I still had a legal duty to protect my mother from homelessness. He tried to spin the narrative back to his emotional manipulation, insisting that my vast wealth obligated me to forgive the debt and support them financially. I sat perfectly still, watching their desperate flailing. They thought they could use the legal system as a weapon against me, just as they had used the media. They thought a sleazy lawyer and a few fake tears would be enough to force me into submission. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. They did not realize that the very foundation of their argument, the twisted concept of familial obligation, was about to be utterly annihilated by a single undeniable piece of evidence. I glanced at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, waiting for the ultimate truth to finally enter the room. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and a bailiff stepped through, loudly announcing the arrival of the presiding judge. The low murmur of conversation instantly died out as everyone in the room rose to their feet. Richardson adjusted his cheap tie and puffed out his chest, preparing to unleash his full arsenal of theatrical manipulation on whoever walked up to the bench. Yvonne dabbed her eyes one last time, making sure her expression was perfectly poised between long-suffering dignity and maternal heartbreak. Trent stood tall, trying to look like the respectable, unfairly targeted businessman he so desperately wanted to be. They were all ready for a performance. They were entirely unprepared for the reality that just stepped into the room. The judge who walked up to the elevated bench did not look like the easy mark Richardson had been hoping for. She was a striking, formidable African-American woman in her late 60s. She wore her black judicial robes with an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. Her posture was perfectly straight, and her gaze swept across the courtroom with a sharp, piercing intelligence that immediately commanded total silence. This was a woman who had spent decades dismantling lies and punishing fraud. She was a titan of the Atlanta legal system, known for her razor-sharp intellect and her absolute zero-tolerance policy for courtroom theatrics. She was also the Honorable Evelyn Dubois, my mother, the woman who had legally adopted me 23 years ago. The woman who had taken in a terrified 9-year-old girl who had been dumped on a stormy highway and raised her into a titan of private equity. She was the very reason my last name was Dubois, and not whatever insignificant name Yvonne had given me at birth. I did not turn around to look at Yvonne's face, but I could feel the sudden chaotic energy radiating from the plaintiff's table. Rochelle let out a sharp, audible gasp that echoed in the quiet room. She grabbed Trent's arm, her fingernails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Trent stared at the bench, his jaw dropping open in sheer disbelief. He had spent weeks dragging my name through the mud, accusing me of using dark money and abandoning my poor black family. He had built an entire media campaign portraying me as a cold, isolated corporate shark. He had completely failed to do a basic background check on my legal parentage. Yvonne was frozen. The crumpled tissue fell from her trembling hands and landed silently on the floor. The woman sitting on the bench was the living, breathing proof of her own catastrophic failure as a mother. Evelyn was everything Yvonne had always pretended to be, but never could achieve. Evelyn was powerful, respected, and wealthy through her own hard work and brilliant intellect, not through manipulation and marrying rich men. Evelyn stood behind the bench and looked down at the documents placed before her. She did not look at me, and she did not look at the plaintiffs. She maintained perfect judicial decorum. She picked up the gavel and tapped it once against the sounding block, bringing the court to order. She cleared her throat, her voice projecting clearly and powerfully across the room. "Before we begin these proceedings," Evelyn said, her tone crisp and professional, "I must address a matter of formal judicial protocol. I have reviewed the docket for this emergency injunction and the subsequent lawsuit filed by the plaintiffs, Yvonne Dubois and Trent Blackwood, against the defendant Valerie Dubois." Richardson stepped forward, a confused and nervous expression, slowly replacing his initial confidence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice lacking its usual theatrical boom, "is there an issue with the filings?" Evelyn did not even glance at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the official documents. "There is no issue with the filings, Counselor," she replied sharply. "However, there is a significant conflict of interest regarding my presiding over this specific case. The defendant, Valerie Dubois, is my legally adopted daughter. I have been her sole legal guardian and mother for the past 23 years. Therefore, I am officially recusing myself from these proceedings to ensure the absolute integrity and impartiality of this court." She hit the gavel one more time. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "The administrative transfer has already been completed." Evelyn continued, setting the gavel down. "Judge Harrison, a highly capable and entirely impartial colleague, will be taking the bench immediately to preside over this hearing. This court is in a brief recess until he arrives." Richardson looked like he had just been physically struck. His entire legal strategy, built on painting me as an isolated, ungrateful child, actively destroying a helpless mother, had just been incinerated in less than 2 minutes. He turned to look at Yvonne, his eyes wide with panicked confusion. Yvonne could not meet his gaze. She was staring at Evelyn, her face a mask of absolute horrified shock. Evelyn did not leave the courtroom. She stepped down from the elevated bench, her black robes flowing behind her. She walked deliberately and purposefully across the floor, moving directly toward the defendant's table, where I was sitting with Marcus. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it could shatter glass. She pulled out the empty chair directly beside me and sat down. She was no longer the presiding judge. She was now sitting in the courtroom as my legal mother and my fiercest protector. She leaned over and placed her hand gently over mine, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. I looked at her and offered a small, genuine smile. We did not need to exchange words. The psychological blow to the plaintiff's table was absolute and devastating. Yvonne's entire narrative had just collapsed. She could no longer play the role of the grieving mother searching for her lost child, because the woman who had actually raised that child, the woman who had loved and protected her when Yvonne had thrown her away, was now sitting right in front of her, radiating power and unshakable support. The contrast was brutal and undeniable. Yvonne was a desperate fraud trying to extort money to save a Ponzi scheme, while Evelyn was a titan of justice who had built a real family out of love and resilience. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened again, and Judge Harrison strode in. He was a no-nonsense jurist, known for his sharp impatience with frivolous lawsuits and emotional manipulation. He took the bench, sitting down heavily and pulling the massive file toward him. He looked over his glasses at Richardson and then at the plaintiff's table, his expression already conveying a deep skepticism about their entire case. "All right, counselor," Judge Harrison said, his voice gruff and impatient. "I have reviewed these emergency filings. You are asking this court to block a standard commercial foreclosure, and you are attempting to sue the primary creditor for familial support based on an obscure and highly questionable interpretation of state law." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "You had better have some compelling, verifiable evidence to support these extraordinary claims, because my patience for courtroom theatrics is incredibly thin today. Proceed." Richardson swallowed hard, visibly sweating under the intense scrutiny of Judge Harrison, but he tried to muster whatever theatrical courage he had left in his cheap arsenal. He called Yvonne to the witness stand. Yvonne stood up slowly from the plaintiff's table, acting as though the sheer weight of her maternal grief was physically crushing her fragile body. She walked to the stand with a perfectly choreographed limp, taking the oath with a voice that trembled in all the right places. She sat down and immediately pulled a fresh tissue from her designer purse, dabbing at the corners of her eyes, before a single question was even asked. Richardson approached the podium and asked her to describe her relationship with me and the specific events of 23 years ago. Yvonne launched into the performance of a lifetime. She looked up at Judge Harrison with wide, sorrowful eyes and spun a fairy tale of absolute tragedy that belonged in a daytime soap opera. She claimed that I was a deeply troubled and rebellious child who had tragically run away from home during a terrible storm. She cried heavy crocodile tears, telling the court that she had spent the last 2 decades searching for her lost baby girl. She described endless sleepless nights and a heart completely shattered by my sudden disappearance. She claimed that when she finally saw me at the charity gala weeks ago, she was overwhelmed with pure maternal joy, only to have me ruthlessly attack her and try to steal her only home. She painted herself as a loving, devoted mother who was simply trying to survive the vicious corporate assault of her deeply disturbed and heavily misguided daughter. Judge Harrison listened to her entire monologue with a completely blank expression, giving absolutely nothing away. When Richardson finally finished his emotionally manipulative line of questioning, he returned to his seat, looking slightly more confident, thinking he had successfully swayed the room. Then it was time for the cross-examination. Marcus, my lead attorney, stood up from our table. He did not carry any notes or files. He did not pace nervously or raise his voice to create unnecessary drama. He walked calmly toward the center of the courtroom, stopping just a few feet away from the witness stand. He looked at Yvonne with a gaze so cold and calculating that she visibly shrank back into her wooden chair. "Mrs. Dubois," Marcus said, his voice smooth and incredibly dangerous. "You just testified under oath that your daughter Valerie ran away from you 23 years ago. You claimed before this court that you searched for her relentlessly and that her disappearance broke your heart into pieces. Is that your sworn testimony today?" Yvonne nodded quickly, gripping her crumpled tissue tightly, and choked out a fragile yes. She added a pathetic sniffle, stating that she loved me more than life itself and would never willingly let her precious daughter go. Marcus turned slightly toward the bench, keeping his eyes locked on Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," Marcus said, "the defense would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence. It is a certified and authenticated audio recording subpoenaed directly from the Atlanta Police Department archives, specifically from the Emergency 911 Dispatch Center. The recording is dated the exact night my client supposedly ran away. Richardson jumped to his feet, objecting wildly and waving his arms, claiming he had not been prepped for this evidence and that it was highly prejudicial. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down, instantly silencing the sleazy lawyer. The judge stated that given the extraordinary claims of familial obligation and emotional distress being made by the plaintiffs, he would absolutely allow the evidence to be heard in his courtroom. Marcus signaled to a legal aide who connected a small media player to the courtroom's primary audio system. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Every single person held their breath, waiting for the static hiss of the old recording to clear. The audio filled the courtroom, crackling with the weight of decades past. First, there was the voice of a confused and urgent 911 dispatcher stating that a highway patrol officer had just found a shivering, soaking wet 9-year-old girl walking alone on the shoulder of Interstate 85 in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. The dispatcher asked if the woman on the other end of the line was the mother of the child. Then came Yvonne's voice. It was not the weeping, heartbroken voice she had just used on the witness stand a minute ago. It was sharp, annoyed, and completely devoid of any human empathy. "Yeah, she is wandering on the highway," Yvonne's recorded voice echoed off the high wood-paneled walls of the court. "I do not care. Send her to foster care. She is a burden and I am sick of dealing with her." The dispatcher sounded horrified, reminding Yvonne that abandoning a minor in dangerous conditions was a serious crime. Yvonne's recorded response was a harsh, careless laugh that sent a chill through everyone listening. Whatever Yvonne said on the tape, "I just want to bet with my friends that the little brat could not walk home in the dark. I locked the doors anyway. Do not bring her back here." The line clicked loudly and went entirely dead. The entire courtroom gasped in unison. The sound of collective horror washed over the room like a physical wave crashing against the walls. Court reporters and legal clerks stopped typing and stared at the witness stand with their mouths wide open in pure shock. Rochelle turned completely white, her eyes darting frantically around the room as if looking for a quick escape route from the nightmare she was suddenly trapped in. Trent slumped down in his chair, looking absolutely sick to his stomach, as he finally realized the true magnitude of the evil he had married into, and the fatal mistake he had made by dragging this to court. Yvonne was frozen on the witness stand like a statue. The damp tissue slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered to the floor. Her carefully constructed mask of maternal grief had just been violently ripped away, exposing the ugly, rotting truth underneath for the entire world to see. There was nowhere for her to hide anymore. She could not blame the media for this. She could not blame my corporate influence or spin a story about dark money. Her own voice, recorded 23 years ago, had just completely annihilated her entire existence and destroyed any chance she ever had of winning. Judge Harrison stared at Yvonne. His face had transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He leaned heavily forward over the bench, his eyes locked onto her trembling form, as if he were looking at a cockroach. The silence that followed the end of the recording was heavy and incredibly punishing. Yvonne tried to open her mouth to speak, to formulate some kind of desperate lie or pathetic excuse, but absolutely no words came out of her throat. She looked over at Richardson for help, but her lawyer was staring down at his legal pad, furiously packing his briefcase, as if he was preparing to physically run out of the building to save his own career. I sat at the defendant's table perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not gloat or cheer. I just watched the woman who had thrown me away into the storm finally realize that she had just permanently destroyed her own life. Marcus looked at Yvonne and asked her calmly if she needed to revise her previous testimony about her broken heart. Yvonne just shook her head slowly, tears of genuine, absolute panic finally streaming down her face. The illusion was dead. The trap had fully closed. The absolute destruction of my biological family was now a matter of public record, and there was no coming back from it. But I was not completely finished yet. Yvonne was a shattered shell of a woman sitting in the witness stand, but Trent still sat at the plaintiff's table. He was breathing heavily, wiping sweat from his forehead and looking around as if he might still find a way to escape the blast radius of this disaster. He thought the worst was over. He thought that since Yvonne had taken the massive public hit, his own financial crimes might just be swept under the rug as a simple civil dispute over unpaid loans. He was entirely wrong, and it was time for him to pay the price. Marcus turned away from Yvonne, leaving her to drown in her own public shame. He walked calmly back to our table and picked up a second distinctly thinner manila folder. Judge Harrison watched him with narrowed eyes, tapping his pen against the wooden block. The judge asked if the defense had any further evidence to present before he threw this entire ridiculous and insulting lawsuit out of his courtroom. Marcus nodded respectfully. He stated that since the plaintiffs had brought up the matter of complete financial ruin and requested permanent familial support, it was highly relevant for the court to understand exactly how Trent Blackwood had managed to lose the millions of dollars he had illegally obtained. Richardson tried to stand up to object again, but his knees literally wobbled beneath him. He muttered something about relevance, but Judge Harrison immediately silenced him with a harsh glare, telling the sleazy lawyer to sit down and keep his mouth shut before he found himself held in contempt of court. Richardson slumped back into his chair, furiously packing his briefcase, looking like a rat trying to flee a sinking ship. Marcus approached the bench and handed the thick stack of financial documents directly to the judge. He then walked over and dropped a duplicate copy directly onto the plaintiff's table right in front of Trent and Rochelle. Trent stared down at the papers as if they were a live explosive device ticking down to zero. Marcus addressed the silent courtroom. He explained that when Dubois Capital acquired the debt of the commercial real estate startup, my forensic accounting team conducted a mandatory and highly exhaustive audit of his entire financial history. Marcus stated that Trent had repeatedly claimed in his legal filings that his business failed due to unpredictable market fluctuations and predatory lending practices. However, the audit revealed a very different and highly deliberate pattern of wealth distribution that had absolutely nothing to do with the real estate market. Trent began to shake visibly. He reached out and tried to flip the folder closed, but Rochelle slapped his hand away. She stared down at the documents, her eyes scanning the highlighted bank routing numbers and offshore transfer logs. She did not understand corporate finance the way I did, but she could easily read the massive dollar amounts printed in bold black ink. Marcus continued, his voice ringing with absolute unwavering authority. He explained that Trent did not just lose the money he stole from Yvonne's triple-mortgaged mansion in bad business investments. Instead, he systematically siphoned exactly $2 million out of his corporate operating accounts over a period of 14 months. Marcus detailed how Trent used a complex web of fake vendor invoices to funnel the stolen money out of the country, completely hiding it from his investors, his creditors, and his own wife. The money did not go to construction contractors or tech developers, Marcus said, staring directly at Trent. It was wired in weekly installments to a private offshore banking account located in the Cayman Islands. Judge Harrison flipped through the pages on his bench, his expression growing darker by the second. He asked Marcus who the primary beneficiary of this offshore account was. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. This was the final razor-sharp nail in the coffin of the Golden family. Marcus did not miss a beat. He stated clearly for the official court record that the offshore account containing the stolen $2 million was not registered to Trent Blackwood. It was registered to a woman named Chloe Vernon. Rochelle froze. Her entire body went completely rigid as the name echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. Chloe Vernon was not a random business associate or an anonymous offshore banker. Chloe Vernon was Rochelle's former personal assistant. She was the young, eager 20-something woman who used to run errands for Rochelle, pick up her dry cleaning, and organize her lavish social calendar. She was also the woman who had abruptly quit her job and moved out of Atlanta 8 months ago, citing a sudden and mysterious career opportunity abroad. I watched Rochelle's face as the terrible reality clicked into place. She suddenly understood the late-night business meetings Trent claimed to have. She understood the weekend networking trips he took alone. She understood why the money had dried up, and why he was so desperate to force me into giving him a $5 million loan. He was not trying to save their marriage or their family legacy. He was trying to replace the millions he had already stolen and given to his mistress so he could run away with her. The silence in the courtroom shattered completely. Rochelle let out a scream that did not even sound human. It was a guttural, agonizing shriek of pure humiliation and absolute rage. She turned toward Trent, her face contorted into a mask of pure violence. "You gave my assistant $2 million!" Rochelle screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysteria. "You forged my mother's signature to steal her house, and you gave all the money to Chloe." Trent put his hands up in the air, trying to back away from her. He stammered out a pathetic and weak denial, claiming that Marcus was lying and that the money was just a legitimate consulting fee for overseas expansion. But Rochelle was completely beyond reason. The golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on me, acting as if her marriage and her status made her superior, had just been publicly revealed as the ultimate fool. Rochelle physically lunged at Trent right there in the middle of the Atlanta commercial court. She grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit and shoved him violently against the heavy wooden table. Legal briefs and folders flew everywhere as they crashed into the chairs. She slapped his face repeatedly, screaming every foul curse word imaginable. She clawed at his chest, crying and shrieking that he had ruined her life, that he had left her with absolutely nothing while he was busy funding his mistress in the tropics. Trent tried to push her off, but he was too slow and too panicked. He fell backward over his chair, crashing heavily to the floor, with Rochelle landing right on top of him. She was hitting him with her expensive designer handbag, striking him over and over again while he scrambled to cover his face and begged her to stop hitting him. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Judge Harrison was pounding his wooden gavel repeatedly, shouting for order and demanding that the bailiffs intervene immediately. The armed court officers rushed forward from the walls, pulling the golden couple apart. They had to physically drag Rochelle off of her husband while she kicked and screamed like a feral animal. Trent crawled backward across the polished floor, his suit torn and his nose bleeding heavily, looking exactly like the pathetic coward he truly was. Yvonne was still sitting in the witness stand, weeping hysterically as she watched her perfect family literally tear each other to shreds in front of a judge and a gallery of spectators. Through it all, I did not move a single muscle. I sat in my chair at the defendant's table, perfectly composed and entirely relaxed. I did not laugh or smile. I simply watched them destroy themselves. I watched the illusions they had built their entire lives upon burn to ash in a matter of minutes. The money, the status, the arrogant superiority, it was all gone forever. They had spent 23 years treating me like I was dirt beneath their shoes, and now they were the ones rolling on the floor of a courtroom covered in blood and public disgrace. I just watched in absolute silence, breathing in the cold, clean air of ultimate victory. Judge Harrison watched the pathetic spectacle unfolding on his courtroom floor with a look of absolute disgust. He did not shout or bang his gavel again. He simply waited for the armed bailiffs to completely secure Rochelle and drag her back to the plaintiff's table. Trent slowly pulled himself up off the polished floor, his expensive suit torn, and his nose bleeding freely onto his crisp white shirt. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with the panicked realization that his entire world had just been violently dismantled. Yvonne remained frozen in the witness stand, her face buried in her hands, weeping hysterically as the reality of her total destruction finally sank in. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of financial documents Marcus had provided. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the heavy silence stretch out for several punishing seconds. The air in the courtroom felt completely devoid of oxygen. "Counselor Richardson." Judge Harrison finally set his voice, a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. You came into my courtroom today seeking an emergency injunction to block a standard commercial foreclosure. You attempted to weaponize the legal system by spinning a highly sensationalized narrative of familial abandonment and emotional distress. You demanded that this court force the defendant to provide permanent financial support to your clients based on an entirely fraudulent premise. Richardson stood up slowly, his face pale and sweating profusely. He opened his mouth to offer some kind of pathetic excuse or desperate apology, but Judge Harrison immediately cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Do not speak, counselor," the judge commanded. "You have already done enough damage to your own professional reputation today. I have reviewed the financial audits, the property deeds, and the wire transfer logs provided by the defense. The evidence is overwhelming, irrefutable, and entirely damning. Your client, Trent Blackwood, did not just engage in poor business practices. He executed a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar fraud. He forged signatures, he leveraged stolen assets, and he deliberately siphoned stolen funds into offshore accounts." Judge Harrison turned his piercing gaze directly onto Trent and Yvonne. Their entire facade of victimhood had been completely incinerated. They were no longer the grieving mother and the hardworking son-in-law. They were criminals, and they were about to face the absolute maximum penalty of the law. This court finds the plaintiff's claims of emotional distress and familial obligation to be entirely without merit. The judge stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The emergency injunction to block the foreclosures is hereby denied with extreme prejudice. I am granting the defendant Valérie Dubois immediate and full authorization to proceed with the seizure of all contested assets. This includes the commercial real estate startup and the residential property located in Buckhead. Yvonne let out a loud, agonizing wail, covering her face with her trembling hands. She had officially lost everything. The sprawling mansion she had bragged about, the wealth she had flaunted, and the social status she had so desperately clung to were all gone forever. She was going to be thrown out onto the streets exactly as she had done to me 23 years ago. Rochelle sat slumped in her chair, her expensive designer dress ruined, and her makeup smeared across her tear-stained face. She stared blankly at the polished wooden table, completely broken. She had lost her golden marriage, her lavish lifestyle, and her entire false sense of superiority in a matter of minutes. Trent did not cry or scream. He simply stared straight ahead, his eyes wide and vacant. The illusion of his untouchable empire had completely evaporated, leaving him completely exposed to the catastrophic consequences of his own boundless greed. "This court is adjourned," Judge Harrison declared, bringing his wooden gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack that signaled the absolute end of the Golden family. I stood up from the defendant's table, my posture perfect and my expression entirely unreadable. I had won. I had completely destroyed the people who had abused me, abandoned me, and tried to extort me. I had reclaimed my power and secured my assets without ever breaking my cold, calculating composure. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and gave me a silent nod of profound respect. We began packing our briefcases, preparing to walk out of the courtroom as the absolute victors. Trent slowly turned away from the plaintiff's table, his face pale and his movements sluggish. He did not look at Rochelle or Yvonne. He did not look at me. He simply wanted to escape the suffocating humiliation of the courtroom. He took a step toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, desperate to disappear into the anonymity of the Atlanta streets. But the consequences of his actions were not finished with him yet. As Trent reached for the brass handle of the courtroom door, it swung open violently from the outside. Two men dressed in sharp dark suits stepped directly into his path, completely blocking his exit. They did not look like local police officers or court bailiffs. They carried an aura of absolute federal authority. "Trent Blackwood," one of the men asked, his voice hard and uncompromising. Trent froze, his eyes darting between the two men in pure panic. "Yes," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The man reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold badge. We are special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and interstate financial crimes. Trent let out a strangled gasp, his entire body going completely rigid. The second agent grabbed his arms and forcefully spun him around quickly, snapping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the silent courtroom, a sound that signaled the absolute end of his freedom. Rochelle screamed again, a raw, agonizing sound of pure despair, as she watched her husband being physically dragged out of the courtroom by federal agents. Yvonne collapsed entirely, sliding out of the witness stand and curling into a pathetic sobbing ball on the floor. Their perfect golden family was officially dead. They had lost their money, their homes, their freedom, and their dignity. They had absolutely nothing left. I watched the heavy wooden doors swing shut behind Trent, leaving my mother and sister to drown in the catastrophic ruin of their own making. I picked up my briefcase and turned to walk out of the courtroom, leaving the ghosts of my past behind me forever. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the courtroom, stepping out into the wide marble hallway of the Atlanta Commercial Court. The air out here felt significantly lighter and cleaner than the suffocating atmosphere I had just left behind. Marcus walked beside me for a brief moment, his briefcase firmly in hand, before giving me a respectful nod and heading down the corridor to file the final asset seizure paperwork. I was finally alone for a brief second, listening to the sharp, confident click of my heels against the polished stone floor. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settling over my shoulders. The 23-year-old nightmare was finally reaching its definitive end. But the ghosts of my past were not quite ready to let me walk away in peace. Before I could even reach the elevators, I heard the frantic, echoing sounds of footsteps rushing up behind me. Rochelle and Yvonne burst out of the courtroom doors like terrified animals fleeing a burning building. Their perfect, wealthy facade was completely destroyed. Rochelle was hyperventilating, her expensive designer dress visibly torn at the shoulder from her physical altercation with Trent just moments ago. Yvonne looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. Her carefully applied makeup was a smeared, disastrous mess running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. They did not look like the arrogant conquerors who had strutted into my executive boardroom weeks ago. They looked exactly like what they truly were, which was cornered, desperate, and entirely broken. "Valerie, please wait!" Yvonne screamed, her voice cracking and echoing down the long, empty marble corridor. She threw herself forward with a terrifying burst of desperate, chaotic energy. Before I could step back, she collapsed right in front of me, dropping heavily to her knees on the cold, hard stone floor. She reached out with both hands and grabbed fistfuls of my tailored wool coat, gripping the premium fabric so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. "Please, Valerie, you have to stop this," Yvonne wailed. Her face tilted up toward me, contorted in absolute raw panic. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take everything we have in the world." Rochelle stood just behind her, weeping uncontrollably and wrapping her arms tightly around her own stomach as if she were in severe physical pain. "Trent is gone," Rochelle sobbed, her voice trembling with raw hysteria. "The FBI took him away, Valerie. He left me with absolutely nothing. The bank accounts are already frozen, and the credit cards are declining right now. We literally have no money left to our names. You cannot just leave us here to die on the street." Yvonne yanked on my coat, trying to force me to look down into her tear-filled eyes. She resorted to the oldest and most pathetic manipulation tactic in her entire emotional arsenal. "Valerie, please listen to me," Yvonne cried out, her voice desperate and pleading in a way I had never heard before. "I am your mother. I gave you life. Blood is thicker than water, Valerie. You know that deep down in your heart you cannot let your own flesh and blood live on the streets. You cannot throw your own mother out of her home. Please have mercy on us, because we are family." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic, weeping woman clutching my coat. 23 years ago, I would have given absolutely anything to have her look at me with even a fraction of this desperate need. I would have done whatever she wanted just to feel like I belonged to her and to this family. But looking at her right now, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left inside me. There was no sadness, and there was certainly no pity. The deep well of my empathy for these women had run completely dry a very long time ago. I reached down and firmly grabbed her wrists. I did not jerk away or shout in anger. I calmly and forcefully peeled her fingers off my coat, detaching her desperate grip from my life permanently. I took a deliberate, slow step back, creating an impenetrable physical and emotional boundary between us that could never be crossed again. "You are right, Yvonne," I said, my voice echoing cold and hollow in the marble corridor. "Blood is thicker than water. That is exactly why you threw me out of your car on a stormy night and left me to drown in the freezing rain. That is exactly why you placed bets with your country club friends on whether or not I would survive the darkness. You showed me exactly how much our blood meant to you when I was 9 years old and shivering on the shoulder of Interstate 85. Yvonne let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The reality of her own monstrous actions finally crushing whatever was left of her delusional hope for salvation. "You do not get to invoke the sacred bond of family only when your bank accounts run dry," I continued, my words cutting through the air like shards of ice. "You lost the right to call yourself my mother the exact second you drove away and left me to become a ward of the state. You are not my family, Yvonne. You are just a tenant currently trespassing in a property that I legally own." Rochelle tried to step forward, her face pale and streaked with ruined mascara. "But Valerie, where are we supposed to go?" she cried out, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "We have absolutely no one else to help us now." "That sounds like a problem you should have considered before you helped your husband forge legal documents to fund his offshore mistress," I replied, looking at Rochelle with absolute disdain. "I am not your safety net, Rochelle. I am the direct consequence of your own catastrophic greed." I turned my attention back to Yvonne, who was still kneeling on the marble floor weeping bitterly into her hands. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property," I stated, delivering the final absolute judgment that would end her privileged life. "If you and Rochelle are not completely moved out of that Buckhead mansion by Thursday morning, I will have the Atlanta Police Department physically drag you out onto the curb for trespassing." Yvonne let out a long, agonizing wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat that bounced off the corridor walls. She crumpled completely against the stone floor. "And do not bother trying to trash the place before you leave," I added, my voice ringing with total, unshakable authority. "Because I am not selling that house to commercial developers to make a profit. I am donating the entire estate to the Atlanta Youth Foster Care Coalition. The massive mansion you use to host your elite vanity parties is going to become a permanent safe sanctuary for abandoned children. The innocent kids who were thrown away by worthless mothers exactly like you will now sleep peacefully in your precious custom-built bedrooms." Rochelle and Yvonne froze, completely silenced by the profound poetic justice of my final decision. The house they had worshipped, the physical symbol of their stolen wealth and fake superiority, was going to be repurposed to heal the exact kind of trauma they had so carelessly inflicted upon me. The sheer poetry of the moment was not lost on me. The house that represented my ultimate exclusion was now a beacon of hope for children, just like the little girl I used to be. It was the ultimate lasting insult to their superficial existence. They had no words left to defend themselves. I did not wait for a response. I smoothed the front of my tailored coat, turned my back on the two weeping women, and walked away down the long, polished hallway. The sound of my heels echoed steadily against the marble, carrying me further and further away from the toxic wreckage of their lives. Every single step I took was a physical manifestation of my freedom. I left them kneeling in their own despair, breathing in the stale air of the courthouse. I did not look back. I just kept walking toward the exit, knowing the war was finally over. 6 months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the Atlanta Commercial Court swung shut on my biological family, leaving them trapped in the catastrophic wreckage of their own making. The justice system moved with a ruthless efficiency, when presented with undeniable financial crimes and the consequences of their boundless greed, completely reshaped their realities. The universe has a highly poetic way of balancing the scales, returning exactly the same malicious energy you put out into the world. I did not have to lift another finger or say another single word to watch their golden empire crumble into fine dust. I simply stepped back and allowed gravity to do its job, watching as the elite facade they had built over 2 decades dissolved into nothingness. Trent Blackwood, the arrogant tech CEO who thought he could extort Dubois' capital with a fake smile and a trashy tabloid campaign, was violently stripped of his expensive tailored suits and his unearned swagger. He traded his sprawling Buckhead mansion for a cramped concrete cell in a high-security federal penitentiary. The judge had shown absolutely no mercy during his sentencing, handing down a mandatory 8-year term for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and interstate financial crimes. There were no viewing galleries or private equity bailouts waiting for him behind bars. He was reduced to a 9-digit inmate number, surrounded by hardened men who did not care about his fabricated corporate pedigree or his smooth-talking pitches. His offshore accounts were permanently seized. His cowardly mistress vanished into thin air the second the stolen money stopped flowing, and his pristine business reputation was permanently annihilated in the public eye. He had tried to play the role of the untouchable corporate predator, taking advantage of my mother and anyone else who crossed his path, but he ended up exactly where he belonged, locked away in a sterile cage of his own desperate making. Rochelle suffered a completely different kind of prison, one that was perhaps even more punishing for a woman obsessed with status. The golden child who had spent her entire life looking down her nose at me wearing expensive designer dresses and bragging about her elite social calendar was violently thrown into the unforgiving reality of absolute poverty. Trent had not just ruined his own life, he had thoroughly and meticulously destroyed hers. The forensic audit ordered by the court revealed that he had opened multiple high-limit credit cards solely in her name, maxing them out to fund his offshore mistress and prop up his failing Ponzi scheme. Rochelle was left drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of toxic debt that she was legally obligated to repay. With her bank accounts frozen and her credit score decimated, she was forced to take a grueling night shift job at a greasy fast food diner just outside the city limits. The woman who used to mock me for working hard and building my own wealth now spent her exhausting nights scrubbing deep fryers and wiping down sticky vinyl tables for minimum wage. Her perfect manicures were replaced by grease burns and the heavy, suffocating exhaustion of a life she could no longer escape. She had no wealthy husband, no elite status, and absolutely no one left to bail her out of her miserable reality. And then there was Yvonne, the woman who had proudly abandoned her 9-year-old daughter on a stormy highway just to secure a wealthy husband, was finally forced to reap exactly what she had sown. She was physically evicted from the sprawling Buckhead mansion that was now actively being transformed into a vibrant safe haven for the Atlanta Youth Foster Care Coalition. Yvonne was relocated to a cramped, rundown public housing unit on the very outskirts of the city, far away from the glamour she craved. The elite circles of Atlanta society that she had worshipped her entire life completely blacklisted her. Country club invitations ceased immediately. Her phone stopped ringing, and the wealthy friends she used to gossip with pretended they did not even know her name when they passed her on the street. She spent her empty days sitting in a tiny, drafty living room, staring at the peeling wallpaper with absolutely nothing to her name but the bitter, haunting memories of the family she deliberately threw away. She was entirely isolated and profoundly alone, living out her final years in the exact same cold, terrifying abandonment she had once inflicted upon me. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. I sat comfortably in the back of my chauffeured SUV, the soft, steady hum of the engine providing a quiet background to my absolute peace. The premium leather seats were warm, and the interior of the vehicle felt like a protective sanctuary moving smoothly through the early morning streets of downtown Atlanta. Evelyn sat directly beside me, reviewing a thick legal brief for her upcoming court session. She looked over at me and offered a warm, gentle smile that carried more genuine maternal love than Yvonne had ever shown me in her entire life. This was my real mother, the woman who had actually chosen me and built a foundation of unshakable support when I had nothing. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my phone, the screen glowing softly in the dim light of the back seat. I opened the call log and scrolled all the way down to the blocked history. There it was, sitting in the digital archives like a ghostly echo of a war that had already been conclusively won. 79 missed calls from that very first night at the charity gala. 79 frantic, arrogant attempts to manipulate and extort me. I stared at the red notification badge for a long, quiet moment, processing the incredible turbulent journey it took to get from that terrifying moment of ambush to this beautiful morning of absolute closure. I did not feel any lingering anger or resentment. The heavy emotional weight that had tied me to their toxic existence for 23 years was completely gone, replaced by a profound and lasting clarity. I pressed my thumb firmly against the screen and swiped left, permanently deleting the contact and wiping the 79 missed calls from my phone forever. The screen cleared, leaving no trace of their existence. I slipped the device back into my bag and turned my attention toward the tinted window. The dark skyline of Atlanta was breaking open as a brilliant, bright sunrise flooded the awakening city with warm, golden light. I took a deep, clean breath, watching the vibrant colors wash over the towering glass buildings, finally and completely free from the ghosts of my past, ready to embrace the empire I had built. The most profound lesson from this journey is that family is never defined simply by blood. It is defined by who chooses to show up, protect you, and nurture your growth when you have absolutely nothing. Toxicity does not deserve a free pass just because it shares your DNA. True power and ultimate healing come from establishing ironclad boundaries and refusing to let anyone weaponize your past trauma for their own greedy gain. When you build your life on a solid foundation of independence and unshakable self-worth, you become entirely untouchable. The ultimate victory is simply living your truth. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace and build your own empire? Share your story of resilience in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering journeys of taking back your life.